All right, the midpoint of a segment is the point that divides the segment into two congruent segments. So here we have a line segment right here. This is the midpoint. It's exactly in the middle, which means that this side and this side, AB, would be congruent to BC. So let's say the whole line was from here to here was 8. If this is the midpoint, then this side would have 4 and this would be 4. So it would be the same distance on both sides of the midpoint. Now, this midpoint is kind of horizontal, right? So when they're horizontal or straight vertical, it's kind of easy to figure out the midpoint. However, if you have a line that's slanted like this and you have to determine the midpoint, it gets a little bit more complicated, and that's why there is the midpoint formula. So the midpoint formula is when you have slanted lines and you want to figure out what that midpoint is so that both of those sides of the midpoint are congruent to each other and have the same length. So this is how you determine the midpoint. So the first point, this is your x1 and this is your y1. Then the second point is your x2 and your y2. That's a 2, okay? And this is the midpoint formula. So when you have those 2 points, you basically take the two x parts and you add them together and then divide it by 2. And then you take the y parts, you add them together and divide it by 2. And really you're taking the average, right? Like if I was taking the average of 3 and 4, how do you do that? Because the average is kind of like the middle between those 2 points. You add them together and divide by 2 because there's 2 numbers. So that would be 7 divided by 2, which is 3.5, which is the halfway distance between those 2 numbers. So really with the midpoint, you're taking the average of the x values, you're adding those together and dividing by 2, and then you're taking the average of the y values, okay? So with this point here is 4, 1. So that's our x1 and our y1. And then this point here is 10, 5. So this ends up being my x1, y1. This is my x2, y2. So we substitute those into the formula, right? Here's our x's. We're taking the average of 4 plus 10 all over 2. 4 plus 10 is 14 divided by 2. That's how they get the 7. And then we take the average of the y values, which is 1 and 5. So 1 plus 5 and divided by 2. 1 plus 5 is 6 divided by 2 is 3. So that means the midpoint of these 2 points is 7, 3. Okay, let's go ahead and look at some examples and apply the midpoint formula. Okay. Here we go. Example 3. So finding coordinates of the midpoint. So find the coordinates of the midpoint of PQ. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write that midpoint formula. Okay, so the midpoint equals x1 plus x2 over 2 and y1 plus y2 over 2. And I want you to do that for every single problem. Then we're going to go ahead and define our terms. So we have 1, 6 and 7, 2. I'm going to call this my x1, y1. And this my x2, y2, and then we're just going to substitute it in. So the average of the x values would be 1 and 7, right? And the average of the y values would be 6 and 2. That's my y1, that's my y2. Okay. And this is going to give us our midpoint. And so then we just do this work. 1 plus 7 is 8. 6 plus 2 is 8. And then 8 divided by 2 is 4 and 4. So that's our midpoint, 4, 4. Our midpoint is right here, which means that this side and this side are congruent to each other. All right. Okay, very cool. Let's try this again. So it says find the coordinates of the midpoint AB. Okay, I'm going to write down that midpoint formula first. M equals the average of the x values and the average of the y values. Okay, I'm going to label. So I'm going to call this my x1, this my y1, this my x2, this is my y2. So every single problem, I want to see this formula. I want to see you defining your terms here. Then we substitute it in. x1 is -3 plus x2 is 2 all over 2, comma, y1 is 4 plus y2 is -3 all over 2. And then we just simplify. -3 plus 2 would be -1 over 2. 4 plus -3 would be 1 over 2. So that is our midpoint would be -1/2, which would be right about here, and then up 1/2, which would be here. Here is our midpoint, which means this side is the same distance as that side. All right, this is our answer. Those are the coordinates of our midpoint. Okie doke. Now it is your turn, ladies and gentlemen. I want you to find the coordinates of the midpoint of this line segment below. Make sure you write that midpoint formula and define your terms. And here's my friend, the pause dragon. Remind you to pause your device. Go ahead and work this problem out. When you get done, press play and we'll talk about it. All right, see you in a bit. Okay, the first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and write down that midpoint formula. M equals the average of the x values and the average of the y values. Okay, then I'm going to define my terms. This is x1, y1. This is x2, y2. And then we just substitute those values in. This x1 is -2 plus 6 all over 2. And y1 is 7 plus 3 all over 2. And -2 plus 6 is 4 over 2. 7 plus 3 is 10 over 2. We end up with 4 divided by 2 is 2. 10 divided by 2 is 5. And there's our midpoint, 2, 5. So if we were to graph that, 1, 2, and up 5 would be right here. This is our midpoint, which means these two sides are the same distance apart. All right, if you got that right, you did a wonderful job, and I will see you next time.